Well, good afternoon, Manya. Great to be able to chat with you again. Thank you so much for volunteering to come on the Meaning Project podcast. I've been doing a lot of work with resiliency lately. And so naturally, after your soon to be award winning TED Talk was recorded, I thought of you and was really excited to have you come on and chat with us about your experience with resiliency.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I'm excited to be here. And resiliency is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I also hate, which we will get into.
Yeah, right, right. I know we've had some casual conversations about that. Well, let's get right to that because as I was reviewing your website again for today, I love your tagline, right? Let's talk about that a little bit. The tagline on your website is, and correct me if I get it wrong, what if you're not Boston strong?
Yes, that came about because, as you know, Dan, I'm a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. And my experience is that I was, knock wood, great. I'm so grateful that I was not physically injured.
Mhm.
But I walked away with post-traumatic stress and had a real difficult time, struggled with that, and still occasionally struggle with that.
Mhm.
And in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, the hashtag Boston Strong got to be really popular. And, intellectually, even then, I could recognize that this might be something that people found valuable. And it was a way to rally people together and to say, hey, we're strong and we're gonna get through this. Unfortunately, that intellectual understanding never extended to my emotional understanding, and it felt very much to me like it was saying you need to be strong, and if you are struggling, you know you're doing it wrong. Or I looked at it thinking, okay, everybody is Boston strong except me, so what's wrong with me that I can't get over this? And I'm thinking these things, weeks after the bombing. I'm not even sure when that hashtag started, but it was pretty quickly. And, I thought that meant that I wasn't strong and I wasn't doing it right. And so it was very hurtful. And while I understand intellectually, as I mentioned, and I'm largely past the emotional part of it, I'm still not. I've been traveling abroad and I see people in hashtag Boston Strong t-shirts, and it just, uh, it still can be really frustrating and feel hurtful. And I
Yeah.
know that isn't anybody's intention.
Of course not. Of course not. But I mean, almost that idea, not just, I mean, the hashtag itself, but the ideas behind it can be as potentially triggering as maybe some other experiences you went through.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you say you were not Boston strong at that time, uh, of course, many people were not, but in that moment, I'm sure you felt singled out. Can you share a little bit about maybe what it was you were going through that you felt not Boston strong?
Absolutely. So, in the immediate aftermath, I'm thinking the days after the bombing, which happened to be on a Monday, and Tuesday I went back to work and was just struggling to sleep, struggling to even figure out what to eat and to take care of myself. I started having nightmares. So when I was lucky enough to actually fall asleep, I would be awakened. I was having anxiety attacks or panic attacks, and these were new. And so in the days and weeks afterwards, I was struggling with a lot of these symptoms, including intrusive thoughts, which I had never heard of, never even imagined. And, I don't know that we need to get into it, but are just really not happy. And I didn't know what was happening to me. And I'm watching the news like a lot of people, but on two different levels. On one level, trying to figure out what happened, who did this, why did this happen? But on the other level, looking for, are they going to tell stories about people like me? There were catastrophic physical injuries and there were deaths, and those were leading the news. And there wasn't really much about the mental health impacts or the emotional impacts. And when they did interview somebody who was a witness, it was to talk about what they saw happening, when they saw the bomb, how they might have helped some of the individuals who are physically injured. So there wasn't a lot of attention paid to the mental health side.
Mhm.
So that's part of what had me feeling isolated and alone, because I'm looking at the news and I'm listening to the leaders in my city and state talking about all this, and they're not talking about the mental health impacts. So I started to think, well, it's just me.
Right, just you. Yeah, that's such an important idea to look at. I recall, from a distance, this was a prolonged investigation. A lot of conversation about the details, the who, and the what. And so often in these situations, but especially in that situation, it almost seemed forgotten. The mental emotional carnage that was wrought upon so many people. We
Yeah.
do a great job in our media of looking at the details, showing ad nauseum, replaying constantly the scenes and the video, and the I remember the police video of finding the perpetrators.
Mhm.
And then when that was done, that was it. And
Right.
meanwhile, there's t-shirts coming out that, hey, we're all Boston strong, but the people that were experiencing these very well-known, right, in my field, well-known
Yeah.
symptoms that can be devastating. When you say intrusive thoughts, my first reaction, I'm sorry, was, well, of course you did. uh,
Yeah.
on the other hand, most people in the world don't, what the hell is an intrusive thought?
Yeah.
Or what, we talk about PTSD and its symptoms, but you lived them. At what point did you realize it wasn't just you, or maybe it was just you, and you needed some help with this?
Interestingly, I realized I needed help really quickly.
Mm,
And I've learned later that the timing for me to reach out for formal help is relatively rare. So the marathon is always on a Monday.
mhm,
So the following week on that Monday at 2:49 p.m., the city held a moment of silence in honor of those who had been killed. And um, so that was, 2:49. I would say by 3 or 3:30 that afternoon, I was on the phone to my doctor's office in their behavioral health department,
mm,
because I just didn't know how to process what I was feeling, and I didn't know how to deal with it. And to me, a therapist was a natural fit.
good.
I'd been to therapy before in the past, and I knew that was somebody who could help me.
Mhm.
Reaching out to friends and family was something I continued to do, but I didn't see them as being the same kind of resource as a mental health professional. And I still, started to see a talk therapist, and
Mhm.
got an emergency mental health appointment, which never knew it existed. And awesome. I got in.
Okay, I'm curious how that happened. Well, maybe during that time it was more prominent, but how? That's awesome. How did you manage that?
So, as you know, there are certain questions they want to ask you before you're going to come in, right? They're going to schedule your appointment. Are you a danger to yourself or others? And some of those just kind of typical intake questions. And I was just talking to them like I'm talking to you.
Mhm.
This, no, yes, da da da. This is my name. This is my medical record number. And then she said, "Why do you want to come in?" And I just started crying.
Mm,
And I think I squeaked out the words, "I was at the finish line." And the woman on the other end of the phone, her whole demeanor changed. And um, the next thing I know, she got me in for a lunchtime appointment the next day, which I am certain was that clinician's lunch hour.
sure.
But she clearly realized that I needed help, and this was not going to be, we can get you in 2 months from now. And I am forever grateful, because that was very helpful for me to start any kind of therapy with a professional. And then I started getting, I'm pretty stubborn, and I kept looking for resources for survivors
Hmm.
and trying to figure out, well, what are you going to do for us? And any little clue that I could find, I would follow. And I ended up seeing a trauma counselor who were providing services to bombing victims.
Hmm.
And I saw her both individually and as a group with other survivors. And that was also really important to learn about trauma as something that happens to a person. Not that there was something wrong with me. What was happening to me was a response to the trauma. That was a difficult mindset change for
Hmm.
me,
Hmm.
to switch from there's something wrong with me to, oh, no, 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 no. Something happened to me that I am needing to process, and it's taking a little bit longer than maybe for some other people.
Right. Well, and the list of symptoms you described earlier, I mean, that is a predictable and expected response to a life-threatening event for a
Yes.
clinician, right? Like, again, well, of course you experience those things. Unfortunately, not enough people in out in the world that aren't clinicians realize that. I'm very happy for you that you had already had an experience with therapy. You knew to make that call. And of course, the appropriate response in a situation like that from a clinician is say, absolutely, I can go without lunch tomorrow because you cannot go without therapy tomorrow.
Yes. Yes. And it's still really special to me that was something that was possible. I know now there certainly are some challenges. There have always been some challenges with mental health care and getting therapy when someone needed it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if something like that would be able to happen now.
Mm-hmm.
But I do, appreciate just like, yep, we're getting you in. And, Dan, you talk about how known this is in the mental health community and, the social work side of things. And I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
As a just regular person going about my life, I'd never thought about the mental health impacts of any of the other tragedies that happened before Boston that I was
Right.
merely a news viewer on.
Right.
Um, and then I started to learn more about it after I was dealing with it and processing it. And I started to realize, wait a second, this is known and very knowable.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that, the official responses from the city, the government, whoever is kind of swooping in to help, why is it that they haven't gotten that information, or
Mm-hmm.
they have gotten the information and chosen not to act on it? And so that also led me down this path of advocacy and talking about this, because what? Like, I had been under the impression that the reason we didn't get help was because nobody really understood there would be people walking away with, mental health injuries that we, have struggled to recover from.
Right.
Yeah, but that's
I think in the time since that, we've gotten slightly better.
okay.
Sometimes not great. Really PTSD began to gain traction in the early 2000s with soldiers returning home from the wars in Afghanistan. We started to see, and maybe even before that, and maybe that's just my bias because that's when I started noticing it as a clinician. And over the years, we've gotten a little better, but still in our world, not in the public view. Maybe in the
Yeah.
past 5 or 10 years, we've gotten a little bit better when there have been difficult, traumatic disasters, terrorist events, situations. I can recall the building collapse in South Florida
Mm-hmm.
just in the past year. And actually, my brother was on the task force there providing medical care to the rescuers, but he did say that there were people providing mental health care to the people that were doing the work. So maybe in some areas we've gotten better. Unfortunately, not in all. And that's why we continue to need people like you going out and taking your message saying, hey, I survived this, but it could have, for others, it could have been better. Quite honestly, I don't think it could have been much better for you. You had therapy before, you knew a therapist was helpful, and you got in within 24 hours. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, if that clinician is out there, thank you for making us all look good and doing an amazing job. That's beautiful. I am curious. Now, the therapist you initially met with that next day, was that the same therapist you worked with? Was that an intake person? How did that process work for you?
That was the same therapist I worked with for a short while.
Okay.
That was not an intake person. She got me onto her calendar. Um, you know, when you go to therapy, people talk about, you should interview your therapist and find someone who's a good fit. And to me, that interview was, you are available tomorrow at 12
Right.
and I am walking to your office. So to me, that was the whole level of the interview. And so we worked together for, I'm not even remembering, I would say just a few months.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, I transitioned out and found a new therapist.
Hmm.
And there was a point in the summer. So the bombing was in April. So that summer, where I was having once a week, I was having an appointment with my talk therapist,
Hmm.
an individual appointment with a trauma counselor, and then a
Hmm.
group session with a trauma counselor. And I did not even feel that was enough. Like
Sure.
it felt like, can I have 5 more of these this week,
Right.
please?
Right. Absolutely. I'm sitting here as a clinician saying, man, that is an amazing set of services.
Yeah.
And that really does make sense to me. You met with whoever was available in the beginning because they were available. And
Yep.
most of us can provide that initial care in any way of just, hey, let's talk about what you're experiencing and really do a good job of that. But you're right, at some point, somebody focused on trauma. I can provide, it's not me, but I certainly can help in the beginning. And then
Yeah.
I know people that have studied trauma, and it is such an important specialty to have.
Yes.
Now, I'm curious, and group therapy as well. I do different kinds of group, not trauma. And we know that when you get around other people that experience the same thing, it can be so helpful just to recognize, as you said in the beginning, it isn't just me, it's
Mhm.
other people too.
That was huge. And I remember that. So there, one of our groups had a person who also attended a group therapy for people with physical injuries. She did have
Mm.
some physical injuries, was not hospitalized, so she came to ours, and the mayor of our city visited the support group
Mm.
for the people with the physical wounds, and just the things that we said in our group and the look on people's faces, not that we wanted the mayor, needed the mayor to come and sit in our group, but the fact that there was not even recognition that we were also struggling. Like, I think nobody wanted to talk to the mayor, right? But the mayor coming to our group would have been acknowledgement that, yes, you guys are not invisible. We recognize what happened to you. And it was hurtful, to just have that as a reminder that, like, the officials don't even see us.
Yeah.
um, and before we move on, I wanted to actually take a step back, because you talked about the great set of services that I got.
Mhm.
And I want to take a moment and acknowledge that there's a lot of privilege in the fact that I was able to get some of these services. I have health insurance,
Mm.
and I'm reasonably comfortable navigating the healthcare system. And I had experience in the mental health care system. So those things were kind of a natural fit for me,
Mhm.
even if the specifics were unusual or different. I know I have met several survivors of the bombing who did not know, were not able to get some of the group services that I did because they didn't find out about them.
Mm.
So I found out about them because, like a friend of mine says, I can be like a dog with a bone. And I ended up going to a public meeting where a Red Cross volunteer had some information. And the information was for people impacted by the bombing. And it had trauma counselors' names and the local victim services organization, MOVA, the Massachusetts Office for Victim Assistance.
Mm.
And then I called them, and I just kept calling everybody who I thought could help me.
Wow.
And once I got into MOVA, then I got access to the services that they were providing. But I met people 3 and 4 and 5 years later who'd never heard of MOVA.
Mm.
Because if you've never been a victim of a crime, why would you think to reach out to a victim assistance association?
Right.
And so therefore they didn't know about the group therapy, for example, and they didn't know about the trauma specialists. And, and the people that I talk to who are in my circle are all also relatively privileged, like I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that there were many people who didn't know resources were available,
Right.
and also might not have had the opportunity to seek out services on their own, whether by inclination or fees or anything like that. So I consider myself lucky in some ways that I was able to get the kind of help that I was, and to realize that I still struggled,
Right.
even with all of those advantages.
Right. And I think that is just another indication of the important work for little podcasts like this, for the amazing TED Talk you did, for the advocacy work you're doing, getting out into the public and speaking about this. More people need to know about it, so those that aren't as privileged get some kind of services so that they can be made whole again.
Yeah.
I am curious. And I want to certainly talk about your advocacy work and your TED Talk. But before we move on to that, just for those that are listening that might be struggling with some after effects of any kind of trauma, what do you think helped you most? Getting in quickly, having a talk therapist? Was there anything? What was special about maybe trauma therapy that was helpful for you?
Oh, everything about trauma therapy.
It's great to hear.
You know what, the single most important thing about trauma therapy, though, was the acknowledgement and the understanding that it is something that happened to me. And then the work was unpacking, what was my response? Why might I be responding this way? How can I take care of myself? Like, what are some strategies? If I'm having intrusive thoughts, what are some strategies? If I remember before I got on an airplane for the first time after this, I was very anxious because what if I'm feeling uncomfortable? You can't get off the airplane, and I don't want to be on the news as the woman who's trying to open the emergency exit door at 35,000 feet. So we strategized things that I could do. And, I wrote them down and I put them in my wallet. So here's the list in this order. If this doesn't work, try the next thing. If this doesn't work, try the next thing. So I think the recognition of what trauma is and how it impacts somebody's life, and then some of those real practical strategies, I'd say, were the most helpful.
So acknowledgement, strategies, I think group therapy, and this really goes for anybody struggling with anything. Group therapy can be so powerful, especially in a trauma situation. I run substance abuse groups, but that group setting, regardless of issue, can be so helpful in looking around and recognizing, as you did, oh, I'm not alone in this. Other people are struggling with whatever the issue might be. And that's something I often encourage, even if it's, not a therapeutic group, but a support group. That can be so helpful. Now let's go back to recognizing this is not a weakness of mine or something that I'm weak, but it's something that happened to me, and I'm having a predictable set of responses. How does that maybe contradict Boston Strong?
Oh gosh. That is a good question.
Just that idea of going back to what you said, it happened to you, but if you're experiencing this, you're not strong.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is how we think about ourselves, and what is a strength and a weakness. And resiliency is a strength, but is it? So I think a little bit of it is kind of terminology too. And in this country, for all the things that are good and all our faults, still very much seems to me to be this individualist society.
Absolutely.
And we're pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps.
Right.
And so to me, it feels like the message of being strong is about, you can fix it. You can, you should be able to pull yourself up by your own strength. You should be able to stop having intrusive thoughts. So I think it's at odds with the concept of that, because that's not actually how we respond to real life as humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a disconnect between the ideal that I think some people think of and how humans actually respond to life.
Absolutely. There's that nature for us to take it on ourselves, as you did, right? Oh, this is me.
Yeah.
I'm not doing this well, and therefore I must fix it. Whereas it was in an environmental situation that you had predictable reactions to that you needed help getting past.
Yeah.
And when you got that help, it did. Now, I am curious, just from a personal, professional perspective, did you do any EMDR? Do you remember any of that?
I did do
You
EMDR.
did? Okay. We
I
talk about
did.
that on the podcast often. How was that for you? Which version? I'm not trained in EMDR. I refer out for all that, but I'm mystified by it because it's so amazing. What did you do and how was it helpful for you?
I am also mystified by it. And early on in the trauma group, somebody was talking about doing EMDR, and I must have heard them wrong, because for at least a year and a half, if not 2 years, I thought that EMDR was some sort of like electro stimulation, and then it was really physically painful, and I was like, oh, I can't do that.
Yes.
I can't
We
do
do
that.
not put you through shock therapy for EMDR.
No, I guess that's what I thought.
Right.
But somehow I got to a point where I was, I think, kind of plateauing, and I just still needed some help. And the counselor recommended EMDR and then explained to me what it was, which wasn't whatever was in my head. And I said, yes, let's do it. So I don't know how it works, but I can tell you that for me, it was incredibly helpful. It actually turned out for me to be incredibly physically painful as well, but not because anybody was touching me or doing anything. For me, my PTSD, one of the manifestations has just been physical pain. And I had an instance, a particularly difficult time with a session. And when I stood up to leave, I couldn't put weight on my left foot because it felt like my ankle was broken. It was in such pain. Wow. And so to me, it was physically painful, but because of the way my body was dealing with kind of getting all that stress out. And in my case, it was my therapist using her fingers, going back and forth across. And like I said, I never understood what was happening, but I fully trusted her, and I fully believed that I needed to commit to doing it in order to have it work. So I was all in.
That sounds awesome. That's one of the basic forms of EMDR, right? So for those of you that haven't heard the previous podcast about EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, right? And it goes way back into some old science. Do you remember the old timey movies with the evil genius with the stopwatch making it go back and forth?
Yes.
Not evil, the evil hypnotist, right? Watch this. And there's some truth to that in what we call bilateral stimulation, where we alternate parts of the brain that go back and forth. It can be just eye movement going back and forth. For some, there's tapping back and forth between the knees or elbows or hands, lights sometimes. One of the practitioners of EMDR in my office, Chad, great work, Chad, has these amazing, inexpensive PVC pipes with like a rubber ball in it, that if you make the rubber ball go back and forth. I've done this before just for fun, and it's nearly put me to sleep because it is so calming, that back and forth stimulation. But then when we reprocess the memories in a healthy environment, safe and secure with a therapist, the science has told us it unlocks all of those horrible memories, stops all the intrusive thoughts, the nightmares, the flashbacks, and all of those things. It's amazing science that we've really only started to partially understand maybe in the past 2 decades, but you're a great example of it worked for you.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I really felt like it separated the emotions from the event, so I could discuss it and not feel back in the moment, and I could discuss it and not feel the anxiety of of that memory. And yeah, it was, I'm
It's like
really glad I did it.
that is right out of the textbook, like separating the emotions from the memory so that you can reprocess those feelings, but then also remember in a way where the feelings don't come back in such a terrifying and impactful way.
Yes. You
That's,
know, this wasn't part of my EMDR therapy, or it was, but it wasn't actually EMDR. And we talked about finding a happy place, right,
mm-hmm,
in my mind that I could go to and be calm and relaxed,
mm-hmm.
and I had that in my head. And then she had me sort of take my happy place to where I was when the bomb went off. And I sort of came out of it, and like I sort of in my happy place watched it all happening, and was able to be like, I'm not feeling these emotions. I'm
Right,
still feeling relaxed.
right.
And it was the most amazing thing, because, I just never thought I would get there. I
Mm-hmm.
never thought I'd be able to untangle all those pieces, and feel, normal, whatever normal is.
Right, right. Well, um, I think you're an amazing, just yeah, indicator of what good trauma treatment can do and how it can help you through. But then you're taking that message out and sharing it with others. Tell us a little bit. I know you just recorded, just not recorded, but just gave your first TED Talk. Congratulations. How
Thank
was that
you.
for you?
It was amazing. The process of all the work that goes in, just as one speaker before I get on stage. I had coaches that I worked with,
Mhm.
and we worked on, what is the message that I want to share, and then what's the best way to share it. And it was things that I had talked about before, and pieces of other talks that I'd given, but put together in a particular order to tell the story in a particular way.
Mhm.
And a lot of practice, a lot of practice. If anybody in the general Boston area saw me walking down the street in about the 4 weeks previous, I guarantee you what was going through my head was one section of that talk. Maybe it was the beginning, maybe it was the middle, but I was just going over, as I wanted to memorize it. I mean,
Mhm.
we did actually have like speaker presenter view, so we had speaker notes that we
Yeah.
could see, which I was really glad for. But you want to memorize it, so it's
Mhm.
just there. And it was amazing, and
That's
the
awesome.
day went by so fast.
Mhm.
And the anticipation ahead of time, you think it's never coming, and then wait, what, it's over.
Yeah, I love that point about notes. One of my favorite TED Talks, and people listening have heard me talk about Johann Hari a lot. He's one of my favorite authors. Had the chance to spend some time with him. His first TED Talk about chasing the stream, apparently they were not allowed to have notes, but if you pay close attention, I can't remember if it's left or right hand, but he's got some scribbling on the palm of his hand. And I probably watched that video or shared it in a group many times. And I just caught that a little while ago. I said, "Oh, you do have speaker notes."
Oh my gosh, that's great.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit. What do you speak about for those that might be interested in bringing a resiliency speaker to them? Tell us about your platform and what you're trying to help people understand.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So my TED Talk is on making invisible trauma visible.
Mm,
And I use my story as a survivor, some of what we have talked about, as a jumping off point to help people understand how important it is to be paying attention to those invisible injuries. And I also talk about resiliency. I
mhm,
think I mentioned at the beginning, it's a concept I find fascinating, but I also dislike it, because I think sometimes, sort of like Boston Strong, I think we kind of say, well, you're resilient, you know, so you should be fine, and we're all resilient, and let's talk about how resilient we all are.
mhm,
But I think, and what I talk about in the TED Talk is that, if our systems and our institutions aren't supporting that, then that individual resiliency um, matters, but not as much, because now you're fighting against, not getting help, right? You're being told you have to be resilient, but we're not actually going to provide you any services
Right.
to
Or
help
you're
you.
being told you're not resilient, therefore that's why you're struggling.
Yes.
And for those that may
Yes.
not know what this wonderful word resilient or resiliency means, it can be just, what do you mean? How do you define this? And there's an entire, I just spoke in last week's podcast about that. There's an entire science behind it. There's multiple factors that people could be training for beforehand to
Hmm.
be more resilient when a situation happens. But if you didn't know that, you're not
Right.
going to be there.
Never heard of it as a concept about people, like,
Mm-hmm.
personal resiliency, community resiliency. Never heard about that before the bombing. And the first time somebody said at a group meeting, they were talking about how, what resiliency was. I remember thinking, oh, I don't have that. So what am I supposed to do if I don't have that?
Right.
Um, so of course, I learned out I do have it, but I was also comparing myself to other people who had different levels of resiliency.
Right.
And I had a friend who was with me at the bombing, and 2 or 3 weeks later, legitimately just sort of brushed herself off and was fine. She's like, boop, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And she'd processed everything, and she was fabulous. And to me, that was resilient, but I wasn't.
Mm.
So that's been a learning process for me too. So I help, I talk with people about what is resiliency, and, I do touch on personal resiliency is important, but so is organizational resiliency and, compassion and empathy in the organization and how we're dealing with folks. I also work with people on how to communicate about difficult topics.
Mm.
I know, I have a background as a communicator and a writer, coming into the bombing and realizing that some of what was happening was a, communication issue. We weren't being talked about. And if we could change the way we talk about the aftermath of a violent event, for example, which is only one of the many examples we could choose. So I help people also think about how to communicate about difficult situations and, build more compassionate leadership.
Amazing. Who, for those listening out there, if you're considering, hearing Manya's story and wanting to know more, where can people find out more about you and who you speak to, and how to have you come speak for them?
Yeah, well, you can visit my website, which is manyachylinski.com. And we'll put that in the show notes.
We will definitely have that in the show notes, right? I'm not going to
and
ask anybody to come up with that one.
and my email address is conveniently manya@manyachylinski.com. So that's going to be the best way to get in touch with me. I'm also on LinkedIn, and Twitter is where I hang out on social media.
Cool.
Those are places anybody can reach out to me, and I'd love to chat and, see what's going on in your organization and how I can be helpful.
And if people want to see the TED Talk, do you know when that might be released?
I don't know when it's going to be
Okay.
released. There's a whole process, and that involves. So I spoke at TEDx Northeastern,
Mm-hmm.
and the TEDx is those are individually, independently run events, but they share all the videos with the TED organization, and then they are the ones who publish it. So they're dealing with, the volume of all sorts of different TEDx events. So
then the best way to find it
don't
would be to
know.
check out Manya's website. And then I'm sure once that comes out, you will have that posted there.
Yes. And if you are generally on the East Coast, you may hear my scream of joy when it gets published.
I will certainly be listening way out here in Farmville. I hope once that goes live, you will certainly share it, because I would love to share it with the people listening today
I
and the people
will.
that pay attention here. It has been an absolute pleasure. I always love chatting with you, but this was really special. Thank you so much for sharing your story and the work that you're doing. It is such important work. And I certainly hope people will take a look at the work you're doing and bring you out to talk to their people.
Oh, thank you. I always love having a conversation with you too. So this has been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, hey, take care, and we will talk again soon.
All right. Bye-bye.